All right, it should be recording now. So I want to welcome everybody to the first webinar of the year for the CBITs monthly digital mental health treatment webinar. And this is a particularly auspicious beginning because it's also the beginning of the 10th anniversary for CBITs. So we came into existence just about 10 years ago. And it's really nice to have Nick Allen here, who is going to do our inaugural talk this year. So Nick is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Oregon, and he's also the director for the Center for Digital Mental Health. You'll hear, if you don't know Nick, when you hear him, you will hear that he is originally not from here. So before coming to Oregon, he was a professor at the University of Melbourne and in Australia, where I believe you also did your training, or at least part of your training. So Nick's research is focused broadly on the developmental psychopathology for children and adolescents, looking at how family and environment like stress, abuse, socioeconomic disadvantage, how that affects risk for the development of mental health problems. And he focuses on this with the aim of not only understanding the underlying causes, but also as a way of developing targeted approaches for prevention and early intervention. And this work has led him into digital mental health, where he has also been looking at interventions and the use of sensing, of personal sensing in mental health, which he's going to talk about today. So he'll talk for around 45 minutes, and at the end we can have a Q&A, a bit of Q&A. If you have questions, just enter them into the Q&A function, and we'll read off as many as we have time for. So with that, thank you, Nick, and I'm looking forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you so much, David. And thank you for, I did not realize that I was going to be the speaker at such an auspicious moment in CBITs development, but I feel very honored. I feel honored to be asked in any case, but especially honored to celebrate this. CBITs is a group whose work I've been following carefully for many years and have the highest regard for. So it's a real honor to be able to speak to you today. So yeah, so as David said, I'm not from Oregon, but that's where I am now, and I am a professor there in clinical psychology and direct the Center for Digital Mental Health. I'm also the co-founder of a digital mental health startup called Casana Health, and that's been an important recent development in our efforts to turn our research findings into things that products that we can disseminate to really try and transform mental health care. So my first slide is a disclosure slide to make that obvious that I'm a co-founder of and have an equity interest in Casana Health, whose work is related to some of the research that I will present today. So I want to start off by showing you this picture of my lovely wife. And here she is with a VR headset on, and she's currently exercising. She's doing some, I think she might be playing Supernatural or Beat Saber or some product like that. And she absolutely loves it. Now, the thing that's interesting about this, from my point of view, is that she is not a particularly tech-forward person. You know, she tends to be a late adopter and so forth. And so the fact that she is using this device, the Oculus, and using it for exercise is really pretty interesting. And I think that it relates to this question. The reason I mention this is because sometimes we don't really know what the killer app will be for a particular product. You can see, you know, with virtual reality, if you can see this report from 2018 in the tech press, where there was this speculation about, like, you know, VR does not have this killer app that convinces us to buy in. And then this year, another article looking at this idea of the best thing to do in VR is to work out. And here's a quote from Chris Milk, who is the CEO of the company that produces one of the platforms for VR workouts. Fitness is the killer use case for VR. It will be the first driving force for mass adoption. And importantly, he says, what we're seeing is a 50-50 split between women and men, and 60% of our users are over 40. This is not what a typical VR demographic looks like. And so the point is, when we very first introduced technology like VR, there was a strong interest in its application, for example, into gaming. And there was some disappointment with the development of that application. So, we really do need to look at these technologies once they're in the hands of people and find out more about what the real killer app, the application that people will really love and will drive them to use it might be. So what I want to do is look at this with respect to passive mobile sensing or personal sensing. There's various phrases for it, but the idea that we can collect data that's generated as people use their mobile and wearable devices in their day-to-day activities, naturalistically. And there's been a lot of interest in this. I'm very interested in it. I know that the CBITs group and many others have been interested in this topic. And you can see why this is such an attractive proposition to people who are interested in behavioural research or who are interested in interventions, behavioural interventions. So the first thing is it's objective. We can collect these data based on objective variables rather than purely relying on self-report. It's ecological, so you're collecting data in the person's natural environment. It can be collected in an unobtrusive way, so unlike self-report grading scales and things like that, the person doesn't have to interrupt their ongoing behaviour in order to provide data. It provides a very rich individual data set, which can be individualised to understand changes from a person's normal functioning within that individual rather than comparing them to other people. It creates the opportunity for real-time analysis and therefore intervention of those data. And of course, because it's based on, in many ways, a device that most people already own, that is a smartphone, it's highly scalable. And you can see that, with respect, as David mentions, I'm very interested in teenagers and young adults, youth generally, as a critical group for targeting in terms of mental health support and intervention. And you can see that in this group, the proportion of people who own their own smartphone and use it extensively has been rising dramatically and would have risen even further since 2018, where these data are. And we can also see not only are people using them, but the centrality and the importance of these data for people's day-to-day lives is increasing. As you can see, this indicating the increasing importance of social media, video and texting in terms of how people communicate within their personal relationships. So those of us in mental health looked at the emergence of this new technology and thought, this offers some really exciting and unique opportunities. And particularly in the area of measurement of mental health, because it's a unique proposition that we haven't had before. But first, I want to step back and look at where we are currently in mental health practice. And the fact is that we do have standardized questionnaires and interviews, but really only a small percentage of working clinicians out in the field use these measures, even the old-fashioned paper and pencil ones. So, about 10% of psychiatrists, roughly a bit less than 40% of clinical psychologists routinely use these measures in their clinical practice. And yet, we know from meta-analytic reviews and other authoritative sources that when you do conduct routine outcome monitoring, that it has a positive impact on a range of critical clinical processes, including diagnosis, treatment, and communication between the client and the practitioner. So we do want people to use these methods more. And of course, it's one thing to say, well, clinicians, they don't use these methods, but surely in research, we're doing a better job. However, of course, all research does involve a systematic collection of data. But one of the things that's very notable is the absence of objective measures. So we look at the methods that are used in depression treatment trials This is an analysis that we did recently, and you can see that the vast majority of them are using self-report only or clinician observed or interview report, which of course is still based on self-report, and a tiny slither are using some kind of objective measurement, the most common of which is looking at an objective measurement of medication use and compliance. So the question is, though, what's wrong with relying so extensively on self-report? It makes a certain amount of sense, especially with mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, because the core symptoms are essentially phenomenological. So obviously we would want people to tell us how they're feeling in this regard. However, one of the important things is that we know that in a range of different areas of research, when we have objective measures as well as subjective measures, they often don't correlate very highly, and sometimes they don't correlate at all. So examples include studies that have been done, for example, on condom use, where you're comparing self-report versus objective measures. Sleep is an area that I've done some research in, where we look at, for example, wrist actigraphy or polysomnographic measurement of sleep versus self-report. And in substance use, where you can compare, say, urine screens with self-reports of substance use. In every one of these areas, we find that although self-report is a valuable data point, it does not tell us the whole story. So having that objective data is really valuable to round out the picture of what's happening with people in terms of this area of functioning. Now, when it comes to mobile sensing and all these tantalizing possibilities, really the first killer app for mobile sensing that people very quickly gravitated towards, and I would say this includes myself, is the idea of digital biomarkers for symptoms and diagnosis. And you can see some of these press reports, of which there were many, and have been many and still quite regular, seeing where this intriguing idea that your smartphone might know when you're depressed in some way that you don't, it just makes great journalistic copy. And the idea that this new kind of data that's continuous and passive and collecting multiple streams of objective behavior could improve our diagnosis has been an intriguing one. But I do think there's some important caveats that we need to bear in mind. And one of them would be the very long and ardent and expensive effort that has been put into the area of biological psychiatry. And, I've been a participant in this to some extent. I've done extensive research on neuroimaging, a little bit of research on genetics. And, once again, the idea, the hope was that there would be a biomarker that would emerge from this work. But as you can see, this statement here from a recent paper that's just come out in Annual Review of Neuroscience really sums up what many people in the field are saying. As our understanding of the neurobiological and cognitive correlates of mental health and mental illness has grown through decades of research, one thing that has become clear: things are more complicated than we might have hoped. The notion of one-on-one mappings between those abnormalities and mental disorders has all but been abandoned. So this is a cautionary tale that we in digital measurement of behavior should bear in mind and take very seriously. And so one question is, why are biomarkers so hard? And of course, a lot of it has to do, and I'm certainly not unique in saying this, has to do with our gold standard of measurement. Our gold standard of measurement is usually a diagnosis or a symptom rating scale, generally a self-report rating scale, sometimes a clinician rating scale. And of course, the criteria that we're using there are fundamentally descriptive and not mechanistic, especially when they're based on systems like the DSM and the ICD. So, the problem we have is, if we don't know what the ultimate underlying mechanism is that determines the presence or absence of the condition, then, how can you be sure that you're really measuring the right thing? And this is where, what comes to mind when I was doing my graduate training and we were studying intelligence, we were told this old quote, that intelligence is what intelligence tests test. And to a certain extent, depression is what depression tests test. when you don't have this underlying mechanistic understanding. The second issue that makes biomarkers so hard is depression is highly heterogeneous in its presentation. And so here is some data that comes from a study that took people who were diagnosed with moderate to severe depression in the STAR-D study, one of the very significant large-scale multi-center treatment studies that's been conducted. And you can see that even in this group who have all got moderate to severe depression, there's enormous variability in the specific symptoms that are associated with those presentations. And so this makes the question of predicting this ultimate criterion very difficult. And then finally, one other important thing is there's these concepts of multifinality and equifinality. And what that means, multifinality means that one risk factor or underlying mechanism can lead to multiple psychopathological or mental health outcomes. And equifinality means the idea that there are multiple different risk factors or risk processes that can result in a similar clinical presentation. And so this makes the task of using patterns of behavior, even from a very rich data set like the one that we have in digital phenotyping or mobile sensing, to use that to predict symptoms or diagnosis is always going to be challenging because of the heterogeneity of the presentation, but also the heterogeneity of the etiology of the causes. And then finally, there's the question of, is automated diagnosis really what clinicians want? And there's some reasons to suspect that it may not be. The first thing is what clinicians really care about are the insights that drive treatment planning. And so there's this question of diagnostic versus transdiagnostic treatment planning. What that essentially means is that just simply knowing someone has depression or they have a certain anxiety disorder is usually not enough, especially in behavioural treatments, to really define the treatment planning. We need to take those extra steps to make an individual case conceptualization or behavioural analysis to then drive the treatment planning process. And so you can see in the figure here, there is a whole range of these, and there are many others, of these transdiagnostic processes which can be targeted across different diagnostic treatments, and knowing which ones are going to be relevant to which case is not well answered simply by being told that someone has a certain diagnosis. The other thing that clinicians that really want to know is understanding functioning and recovery in vivo. So what's happening in the person's real day-to-day life, as opposed to, for example, how they might look during a clinical consultation. And the other thing that clinicians really care about, we have found, is feedback to adjust their therapeutic strategy, knowing what's working and what's not working in terms of the therapeutic strategy that they're pursuing. And we've seen some confirmation of this from a recent report from a project by Google X, where they were looking at the use of EEG to diagnose depression. And as part of the project, they did some user research, some customer discovery, if you like, and they went and talked to clinicians. And here was what they concluded. They said, our initial hypothesis was that clinicians might use this brainwave test as a diagnostic aid. However, this concept got lukewarm reception in many ways because clinicians actually think they're not too bad at diagnosing the problem. By contrast, there was very strong interest in using technology as a tool for ongoing monitoring, capturing the changes to learn in states over time, to learn what happens between visits. And so, this suggests that this initial application of mobile sensing may not have been the one that is really addressing the primary clinical concern. So I want to start out, move over to talking about what are some of the challenges that we have in mental health care and why we do need innovation, including but not limited to digital innovation. This is a diagram from a recent report on mental health and digital technologies that points out that for every 10 people in the community with a mental health problem, because of various kinds of processes, we really only see about 1/2 of those people, 1 in 20, receiving full benefit from mental health care. And this is, of course, in high-income countries like the United States. So the current mental health care system is not effective for 90% of the people with the disorder in the community. And so it means that we've got a range of challenges that we need to address with our innovation. One is prevention. How do we stop people getting to the point where they have a mental health disorder? The second one is access. How do we make sure that more people can get access to the treatment? Then there's quality, making sure that they get access to good quality care that is consistent with evidence-based protocols. And then finally, effectiveness, discovering new and more effective methods of intervention. And the approach that most people in the digital area have taken is to say, what we really need to do is improve access. This is, digital is highly scalable. It can really improve the access and solve the access problem. And that's a very important part, as you can see here, of the puzzle. However, we do have some indications that simply solving the access problem by itself is not enough. So, for example, this quotes a paper from a colleague of mine in Australia, Tony Jorm and collaborators, where they looked at the trends across time in access to mental health care in high-income countries like the USA, Canada, UK, and Australia. And what they found is that despite the fact that rates have increased, that access had increased quite notably in all of these contexts, there was no evidence for a reduction in the prevalence of symptoms or disorders over the same period. So, and if anything, particularly in the case of young people, there is indications that things may have headed in the opposite direction. So what this tells us is that although clearly the access problem is fundamental, if we don't solve the quality and effectiveness problems as well, then increasing access is not going to get us to where we want to be, where we're really bending the curve in terms of the overall burden of mental health problems in the community. And I think that one of the things that's important for improving this quality is understanding that although we've invented new treatments and new approaches, we've really continued to deliver them primarily through the system that we've used for really over 100 years, which is really this system of office-based clinical consultations. And one of the things that I'd point out here is that we know that this particular pattern of delivering services is a very poor match for what we know about the fundamentals of human behaviour change. So, for example, the principles of behaviour change that are well established in pretty much all areas of behaviour change and skill acquisition are that you have to have something like these elements. First of all, a clear description of the new skills to be learned, along with modelling of those skills. Second, the opportunity for practice with timely feedback. And then specific procedures for generalising these into real-life circumstances. And this is true no matter whether you're trying to learn to be more interpersonally assertive, or if you're trying to do some exposure work, or if you're trying to learn to throw a football or drive a car. And yet, what happens with the way we currently deliver a mental health services is that it's a little bit like a football coach who says to the players, I'm not going to come to the game. I'm not even going to look at any tape. I'm just going to have you come and talk to me once a week and tell me how you think you play. And then I'm going to tell you how I think you should play better next week. But then I'm not going to come to the next game. I'm just going to wait for you to come and talk to me next week and tell me how you think you played in that game. And I put it to you that particular approach to sports coaching would be considered quite absurd. And yet in many ways, that's what we are proposing when we limit our interaction with clients to these office-based consultations and hope that the kind of hard behaviour change that we're asking them to do will somehow generalise. So enter mobile sensing. I think this is where, as you can probably tell from my title, I think this is where mobile sensing may have a really important contribution to make. And I want to first of all, tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've done with mobile sensing. We have developed a research platform called the EARS platform, and our approach essentially combines a collection of mobile sensing data and ecological momentary assessment data. And it's got some particular emphases. We really have emphasized a phone-only approach. We do not use wearables at this stage, because we want the approach to be highly scalable with people's personal smartphones. We also don't ask people to do anything unusual with their smartphone. They use it naturalistically. And of course, it's able to collect data continuously, which has allowed you to look at some of these rhythms and measures that you have. And the particular features that we can extract from these data streams that we collect, which include things like accelerometer and GPS, and keyboard, a range of other measures of screen touches and so forth, include things such as measures of phone and app usage data, language and cognition, particularly from the keyboard, sleep, physical activity, mobility, facial expressions in people's selfies, music choice, circadian patterning, and many other things. So, I wanted to emphasize, perhaps you've heard probably people speak in this series on a number of these measures, but one that we've done quite a bit of work on that you might be interested to hear a bit more about is the language data. And so I'll emphasize that in what I'm going to present next. One of the things that we do see with the language data is that there is high variability, as you might expect, in how much language people enter into their phone on a daily basis. This is an average daily word count from a group of adolescent participants. And you can see that, social media is a huge portion of where those data are entered. Those keystrokes are entered, with SMS, instant messaging being the second most common one, email being a very unlikely use for this group. And, we have done a number of studies now looking at the association of different patterns of language use and keyboard use with important external validators. So, for example, this is a paper that's just recently been published in Digital Health. Lead author is Michelle Byrne, my former postdoc, who's now working back in Australia. And she is, and she and Monica Lind, co-lead author, examined various aspects of the patterns of language that were collected from keyboard behavior with various measures of stress and inflammation. So we had measures of inflammatory factors, as well as measures of stress and psychopathology. So one thing that we see here that's very interesting is you can see from a lot of these heavy lines that the strongest associations, or the most consistent associations with the language variables, is not so much with the psychopathology measures as it is with the stress measures. And that's important because stress is one of those transdiagnostic processes that really is relevant across diagnoses and that would then drive particular transdiagnostic treatment approaches. The second thing is that you can see that the correlation across methods, especially from the language measures to the salivary measures of inflammatory factors, is relatively harder to demonstrate than it is between the language measures and self-report. A second paper that is currently under review that I'll let you know about was first authored by my graduate student, Elizabeth McNeely. And it's a study that we did with a group of 13-year-old adolescents. We collected data across a number of weeks where we collected these messages. The final data set had over 21,000 individual messages. And we subjected those to linguistic analysis of the content. And so some of the key findings from this study is that, there was an association, interestingly, which was consistent with what was seen in the previous study, with the number of words being used and someone's well-being on a given day or mood on a given day. And this was particularly strong for those who are generally have low levels of well-being, indexed by this red regression line here, what we see is that on those days, for those people, on days when they're experiencing low well-being, you see them typing more words into the system. The other aspect of this that's really interesting is the content of the language. And one of the features that we've found is that the use of first-person pronouns is often associated with higher levels of psychological distress. So this represents the heavy line here represents the association between how someone said they felt on a given day and how they and their likelihood of using first-person pronouns. And you can see here that when they're feeling having lower well-being or lower mood on a day, then they've got a higher likelihood of using those first-person pronouns. But what's really interesting here is all these individual lines. These are lines for the individual participants. And as you can see, for the vast majority of them, there is some kind of negative association there that is acting, that is reliable within individuals as well as between individuals, suggesting that this is in fact a good way of tracking these day-to-day fluctuations. Another linguistic marker that was found to be interesting in this study was the use of present tense verbs. Once again, the same idea that when people were having lower levels of well-being, there was a higher likelihood of them using present tense verbs as opposed to other tenses. Other variables that we've looked at include measures of geographic mobility. So this is, one variable that I know has been important in some meta-analyses and systematic reviews that have been done on mobile sensing and mental health is the proportion of time people are spending at home every day. Now, this is some preliminary data from a study that we're doing of young people who are at risk for suicide, and we've got a group of 9 young people who had a suicide risk event leading up to this endpoint of the data, and we're looking at the proportion of people who are experiencing, who are spending time, a greater proportion of time at home. And you can see the rise in that variable that occurs prior to the risk state. This, of course, needs to be validated with larger samples, which is part of an ongoing study that we're doing now. And I will point out that these data are prior to the COVID pandemic. So the particular effects of stay-at-home protocols are not reflected in these data. Finally, another important variable that we've been looking at a lot is sleep. And in particular, the validity of detecting sleep periods with a phone-only approach, just using naturalistic phone behaviour. Here you can see data from a series of individuals where the phone-only approach is used to estimate bedtimes and rise times over time, and you can see that there is some consistency to those variables, as well as some misbehaviour in the estimate that we get here. However, we do see that overall the phone-only approach does provide a pretty good distribution, quite a sensible distribution of these variables. And perhaps more importantly, that when we compare the phone-only data to sleep diary data, we really see that it shows a good level of accuracy. And in fact, a level of accuracy, this lower set of figures, represents the accuracy of the ears phone-only approach, comparing it to the accuracy of a wrist actigraph. This is a research-grade wrist actigraph. And in every case, you want these distributions to be as close to 1 as possible. And you can see that the phone-only approach is doing as well as, if not a little better than the wrist actigraph. So we have some very promising markers of important psychological processes here. And so now I want to talk a little bit about why behavioural activation might be the killer app, so to speak, the approach which is really going to have the greatest clinical utility for this way of measuring behaviour. So I'll start out with a brief description of what behavioural activation is. Behavioural activation is a very strongly evidence-based approach to the treatment of depression, anxiety, increasing well-being in non-clinical groups. And there's also a small amount of data showing some utility in reducing risk for suicide. And it's a very straightforward approach, very simple approach to psychological intervention that basically says what we want to do is we want to change a vicious cycle that characterizes people who are experiencing depression, for example, feeling low. The person then stops doing things that really matter to them, the things that give them a sense of enjoyment or a sense of important, valued actions, the things that give them a sense of self-esteem or pleasure. And therefore they get less out of life, which makes them feel lower. And this cycle, this vicious cycle continues going. So the therapy says one point of intervention is here on this behavioral point. And so we change that by understanding how the person can do more of what matters to promote them getting more out of life, with the ultimate goal of having their mood improve, which then, of course, is permissive of them doing more of what matters, and you get into a virtuous cycle here. And behavioral activation broadly has a couple of key components to it. One is activity monitoring. So this is the tried and true method. It looks a bit daunting, as I'm sure it does to many clients who are given it for the first time. But basically, we get people to record what they do, for example, on an hour-to-hour basis, and to rate everything that they do in terms of enjoyment or pleasure and mastery or accomplishment. And so you can get this individualized pattern of what are the particular activities that promote good mood and well-being for this individual. And that provides a map for the treatment planning. So I just want to make it clear, although this is a very long-standing approach to psychological therapy, it is inherently a personalized therapy in this sense. And so a lot of the talk that we have now about personalization can, of course, leverage this kind of methodology. And then once we understand what are the activities that support good mood and well-being for this person, then, of course, you want to prescribe more of those activities and to problem solve to allow the person to engage in them more often. And these often move from graded task assignments where you break the activity down into small steps to task assignments where you ask the person to solve a number of problems at once to get to the goal. And that's pretty much it. It's a very straightforward approach. The good news about it is that the reason why this is particularly suitable for mobile sensing is that mobile sensing can passively measure some of the critical aspects of behavior that we're interested in: physical activity, social connection, mobility, and although it's not always core to behavioral activation, sleep. It is often a very key component of behavioral treatment of depression. And there is a strong evidence base for its effectiveness. There's been multiple meta-analyses that have shown that this is an effective approach, but also it's very simple to administer. So I'll just quickly describe this complex graph here. This is from a really important study that was published in 2016, comparing cognitive behavior therapy to behavioral activation. And one of the things that they looked at was not only the effectiveness, but also the cost effectiveness of the intervention. And this diagram here represents the trade-offs between the effectiveness with behavior activation being more effective than cognitive behavior therapy or less effective, and it being more expensive versus less expensive. And you can see this simulation of different outcomes based on the clinical trial data suggests that the majority of the time, 66% of the time, the outcome would be that behavioral activation is more effective and less expensive to administer. Another thing that we know about behavioral activation is that it may be, in fact, the most effective component of insulin-delivered cognitive behavior therapy. This is another really interesting paper that was published just this year in the Lancet Psychiatry by Furukawa and colleagues. And what they did is they did a component network meta-analysis of a wide number of randomized trials of internet-delivered cognitive behavior therapy. And what they found was that behavioral activation was probably the strongest predictor of positive outcomes along with other things that are key to these things. Interestingly, relaxation was in fact the one factor that they found was a negative predictor of outcomes. So, and then the final piece of the puzzle that I want to talk about that I know people at your centre are very familiar with, because you've been thinking and writing about this extensively, is how do we encourage engagement with consumer-facing digital mental health apps? And these curves will be very familiar to folks. There is a very rapid drop-off of usage. This is true of all applications on phone operating systems, but is particularly strong, is also true, I should say, of mental health apps. And you can see that the one group of apps that seem to do slightly better are those that are involving peer support, although there's really relatively few observations contributing to that. And so we think that despite the appeal of a scalability that's associated with patient or consumer-facing app alone, we feel that there's still a strong importance of keeping a human in the loop in some way. And this is supported by a range of studies. This is one example from Pim Kuiper's meta-analysis of different formats for delivering CBT for depression. And you can see that all of the group, telephone, individual, and guided self-help formats have similar effectiveness, with unguided self-help, without a human in the loop, being the one that didn't have a significant effect size associated with it. So, what are the particular pain points that people have in delivering this technique that looks pretty promising, behavioural activation? And anyone who's done clinical work will be very familiar with these. I certainly am. One is that the completion of monitoring. This is a huge bugbear for anyone who's doing behavioural interventions. Getting people to complete assessments between appointments that give you a real sense of what's happening in between is often the exception rather than the rule. Not surprisingly, because you're working with people who are really struggling in general in their lives, and therefore adding an extra burden to them of that assessment is something that's often pretty tough for them to meet. There's the accuracy of the monitoring. Am I really getting an accurate insight? There's the completion of behavioural science assignments once they've been set, and then monitoring the effectiveness of these behavioural assignments. So we have developed, this is largely, I should point out, through our company, Ksana Health, an approach to digital intervention that tries to bring together these various streams and to leverage the advantages that I've just pointed out of mobile sensing for behavioural activation in clinical practice. So the mobile app consists of, at the moment, we just ask people those same two questions every day that are asked by the standard monitoring scale that's been used in behavioural activation. I should say that one is, how much did you enjoy yesterday? Another one, this one says, how much did you grow yesterday? We recently changed this language to how much did you accomplish yesterday, which we feel is a better descriptor of the concept we're trying to get to. And then in the background, all the mobile sensing data has been collected and quantified and turned into features, such as features of sleep, physical activity, social connection, patterns of language and social communication, and also geographic mobility. But the individual does not have to effortfully log or journal to achieve that data collection. And then what we get from that is, ultimately, after the person has answered those questions for around about 10 days, then we can give them some feedback on what are the particular activities that for them individually are associated with good mood and well-being based on their objectively measured mobile sensing behaviour. And of course, that then provides a series of intervention targets that are personalised to that individual. So in this case, more sleep might be a particular intervention target. These data can be used in a self-care mode, but they can also be shared with a practitioner through a web portal that we've built, which then allows the practitioner to see these data And then to build out, importantly, use them for treatment planning by building out a series of notifications or nudges that then come out to the person in their day-to-day life to support the behaviour change plan that they're trying to follow through with. And so in this respect, we're trying to solve some of those pain points that I described about the delivery of behavioural activation. The collection of the data is much less burdensome. It's continuous, it's objective and ecological. So hopefully the accuracy is stronger. But then also the system provides this support for positive behaviour change that isn't just limited to the clinical consultation and the advice that's delivered then, but it's actually pushed out in real time at the time of the therapist's design. And so, this is why we are proposing that this might be a more productive way of leveraging mobile sensing in clinical practice, rather than using it primarily for automating diagnosis, which doesn't seem, it has some inherent challenges associated with it, and it seems to be an area that is less in demand from clinicians. We collect the personal sensing data. We therefore understand modifiable behaviour patterns that can be targeted for behaviour change and therefore produce a clinical outcome. Ultimately, in the future, we're really interested in this concept of just-in-time adaptive interventions. And so the idea, once again, of a just-in-time adaptive intervention is that the intervention is designed to provide just-in-time support by adapting to the dynamics of the individual's internal state and context, this last point being the critical one, which is measured continuously. And of course, mobile sensing provides a potential solution to that. And finally, our ultimate vision is to provide, through the combined use of the smartphone app with mobile sensing, smart nudges and communication tools, with the practitioner dashboard, a kind of an ability for the person to move up and down different levels of care without the friction that characterises these sorts of activities at the moment. So the person can move from self-care with the app to maybe getting some automated nudges, to a text-based coaching approach, to telehealth or face-to-face in-person therapy. And you do it all through an application that provides the person with the ability to access the level of care that they need at a particular time. This also obviously has a very good value proposition for healthcare systems, because by using this kind of stepped care approach, they're able to maximise the resources that are available for mental health care and focus those more expensive and time-intensive resources on those who need them most. So that's the ultimate vision. Can't say we're there yet, but it's always good to know what the North Star is. Anyway, with that, I will thank you very much for your attention and for the kind invitation to speak to you. And I'm very happy to answer any questions or have any discussion that people might like to have.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. That was a terrific talk. I have a bunch of questions, but it looks like they're already coming in. So I will go ahead and read off the questions that are coming in. So from Jeff Linder says, speaking from primary care practice, I worry this is similar to other solutions I've seen on cardiac, exercise, functional status, cognitive, and other monitoring. We have no capacity to receive and act on more data. We're already awash in data that we cannot consume. The killer app is actually going to have to deliver less, better data.
Yeah, that's thanks for that comment, Jeff. And I must say that is not the first time I've heard that. We are well aware that busy practitioners, particularly in primary care settings, need very simple. The data needs to come to you in an extremely usable way. You've got short consultations, and it needs to be very pragmatic. So I do want to emphasize that the system that I just briefly showed you is one that is designed for specialist mental health care, and particularly people who are delivering interventions like cognitive behavior therapy or behavioral activation. However, it's entirely configurable for these other forms of practice. And the other thing, of course, ultimately that we want to be able to do is, this is not where we are right now, but we want to build a system that can actually intelligently nudge not only the service user, but also the clinician. So, to sort of highlight automatically aspects of the data that they need to pay attention to. A little bit like when you're looking at a blood screen and you've got it, you're looking down and you want to see those out of range values very quickly so that you can make a judgment about whether they have clinical significance for the care of your patient. So I totally hear what you're saying, and it's definitely something that we're working with, and we're keen to work with people in primary care to understand the user experience, so that we can build a system that people really want to use and that doesn't make them feel awash in data, as you so rightly put it.
All right, I'll encourage folks to go ahead and ask questions. In the meantime, I'll ask one that's a little bit unfair, because it's something that I don't have an answer to and I'm sort of thinking about. But one of it makes sense that you're starting with kind of a behavioral activation framework, because the geolocation data are some of the more reliable features that we have. But I'm also thinking, like, when we detect when we can detect different kinds of things that we haven't had access to, it opens the opportunity to think about new ways of intervening with people. And I'm particularly intrigued with what you're seeing from the keyboard data.
Yes.
It's similar to what we're seeing through not keyboard data, but sentiment analysis that we're getting from, many of the same kinds of features. And we're starting to think about, like, now that we can actually detect how people are speaking, and that's an indicator of well-being, how can we leverage that to begin to intervene with people? Does how people speak, is that a reflection of how they're doing, or does how people, there's some indication that how people speak may actually be able to change? If you speak more positively to people,
Right.
You may develop a more positive attitude. And I wonder if you've thought at all about how to leverage that data stream.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, it's something we're thinking about a lot right now, because we are finding that the language data is fascinating. And of course, language is the stuff of psychotherapy, like it's kind of like the core data of the traditional approaches. So I think you put your finger on a really interesting point, which is that, is the language primarily a sort of an informative assessment, or is it actually a modifiable factor, something that you would target for modification in and of itself? And I think, we don't know the answer to that question just yet exactly. I mean, there is certainly literature that shows that, when you speak differently, in a different mode, then it changes your mood and so forth. And so I think the intriguing possibility is not only, so for example, something with the first person pronoun use, if that reflects an underlying concept like self-focus, excessive self-focus, then there are cognitive methods that you could use that could be suggested by those data, that this is an appropriate approach with this individual to reduce the self-focus, which we know is a correlate of emotional distress. But then the other thing is that you could actually use it as a target of intervention, as you say, and say, okay, this is the skill we want you to practice. We want you to practice, focusing when you're interacting with other people, focusing on the other person a bit more. Something that we often do with people who have social anxiety, for example, or being more positive, and then the system could actually give you feedback about that, which is also gets back to that, one of those principles of behavior change, that if you give people feedback in a timely way about how they're doing, then that's going to be more effective than if they have to wait for the appointment to get it. So I do think the whole language area is super intriguing.
All right, thank you. So other questions are coming in. We got a few more. Ashley Knapp, as folks learn the skills from the digital mental health tools and begin to remit and may not need digital tools as much, do you think this partially explains engagement drop-off we typically see in the use of digital tools. So I'm wondering if we need to rethink our engagement standards. And she also says it was a fabulous talk.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think that I think that's a fascinating question as well that we're thinking about as well. You know, one of the ways, there are sort of two ways to thinking about this. One is that the drop-off is a big problem because behavior change is hard and it's going to take some time, and we want people to engage with these processes over a longer period of time to actually produce meaningful behavior change. That's one perspective. The second perspective is, you know, we should design the interventions, and I know you and Madhu have been thinking about this, David, so that they actually realistically fit into the usage patterns that people have. And I think that's also a very compelling idea. I think the question, you know, the open question for me is, what is the minimum dose that we can provide that produces meaningful behavior change? And there's people playing around with single session and, you know, very brief interventions, you know, and I think we'll learn a lot more about that over the next period of time. For me, I must say I'm still perhaps a little conservative, and I'm in the camp that behavior change is hard and it takes time. And so I would rather try and do what we can to maximize the length of engagement, because I do think that my you know, hypothesis is that that's what we're going to need for really significant clinical effects. But I would love to be proven wrong and to know that we could intervene more briefly and still have really good effects.
All right. Yeah, no, that is certainly one place where I think we'd all like to be proven wrong. So from Barry Greenman, do you include cultural and value factors in behavioral activation?
Yeah, so that's another great question. Yeah, so the short answer is absolutely. You know, that dimension of this is one of the things that's tricky about behavioral activation, and why it is good to have a therapist or a human in the loop in some way, is that really something like accomplishment, mastery, or growth, that dimension is not just about like doing a lot of work. It's really more about values-based action that is meaningful to you in terms of your personal goals. And so it may be something that's got nothing to do with your career. It may be to do with caregiving. It may be to do with volunteering. It may be to do with community engagement. So understanding at an individual level and getting people to reflect on what are the things that give them a sense of accomplishment in the broadest sense of the term is a core feature to behavioral activation. I think that's a very important part where cultural and personal values are critical.
All right, we're almost at the top of the hour, but there's one more question, if you have a moment,
Sure.
from Samprat Banerjee. Mobile sensing data is quite noisy. In your opinion, what is the state of the art in using passive data to generate automated nudges, and the impact of false positives or false negatives of these nudges on the trust of digital biomarkers?
Yeah, so let me say this is where another area where I think for me right now, I'm more comfortable building systems that keep a human in the loop in some way. And I'll explain why. Because really, even in traditional delivery of evidence-based therapies like cognitive therapy and behavioral activation, every intervention you suggest is a hypothesis. You really don't know fully. It's a hypothesis, hopefully, that's based on careful assessment and case conceptualization, but you need to try it to see if it has clinical benefit. And I think this is important in this nudging as well, that we need to not assume that the nudging is, that what's emerging from the data is accurate. The ultimate, but in and of itself, the ultimate test of its accuracy is in fact its utility, in my view, and its utility in terms of the clinical treatment. So if the sensing data suggests something and you try it out and it results in clinical improvement, then I think the case is proven. But that makes it even more important that we do continuously assess and validate that the interventions that we're trying with service users are actually resulting in benefits for them.
Okay, well, I think that that's all the questions. We're slightly over, so I will go ahead and let people go. But I do want to thank you, Nick, so much for giving us a talk that it certainly is of big interest to me in the center here, and I hope all the people who are also listening. For folks who are still here, next month there'll be a talk from Munmunda Chaudhry from Georgia Tech, and she will be talking about social media and mental health. And then the month after that will be Ricardo Araya talking about global digital mental health in the global context. So thank you very much, and we will hopefully see you all next month.
Thanks,
I'll
Nick.
see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.